Good day. Today is Saturday, 13th December 2025. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again, once you've watched the program, if you've liked what you watched, please remember to tick the like button in order to indicate that fact. The other point I want to make very briefly is that I've noticed, to my dismay, that the channel, which has an AI simulation of myself, is still up. I am very grateful to the various people who continue to inform me about this fact. Just to say that the relevant authorities have been informed about the presence of this channel. Presumably there are various procedures before they eventually take it down. Anyway, to repeat again, the only programs in which the real me participates and with which I have a connection and which are broadcast with my permission is this channel, this particular channel, the programs that appear on this channel and the programs that appear, and which I do with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, on the Duran, and also various other well-established and well-known channels upon which I am privileged to appear as a guest. Well, with that, let's press forward with the today's program, and I get a distinct sense today that we are in a situation of before and after. Before being the time before COREPA, the rather shadowy but very, very powerful council of EU ambassadors, about which, by the way, in the past I have commented upon and written extensively. Anyway, the before was before that particular council did what the various media reports were telling us that it was going to do, passed legislation by majority vote, changing the rules in connection with the freezing of the Russian assets and making that freeze indefinite, which is to say, in effect, permanent, whereas previously it had to be reapproved, reconfirmed, by the way, by COREPA every 6 months. Now, I'm going to say a little about COREPA before I continue. This is the Council of Representatives, which meets in Brussels. It gets very little attention. We hear a great deal about the Commission, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Court of Justice, and of course the European Council, which brings together the heads of government and state, and which supposedly is the key institution today of the European Union. There is, of course, also the Council of Ministers, where relevant ministers of the EU also of the EU states also meet. So there is a large number of EU institutions. Many of them, as I said, do attract a fair amount of attention, but COREPA, the Council of Representatives, attracts, in my experience, practically none. And that is a mistake, because it is out of COREPA, this very shadowy institution, that the bulk of EU legislation comes from. They are the people who approve on a regular basis and vote and approve various resolutions and directives and all of these kind of things. Well, the various types of legislation, many of the various types of legislation that get churned out every day by the machinery in Brussels. The Commission does have powers to enact what are in effect normative acts, a type of legislation. The European Council obviously does. That is where some of the main decisions are made. The Council of Ministers also has power to make legislation. But as I said, and individual commissioners can, as I said, make decisions, normative decisions as well. But COREPA, its role cannot be overstated. And as I said, it operates basically in, I won't say exactly secret, but as I said, it's hardly outside the European structures themselves. It's hardly known. Suffice to say that when the European Council approves sanctions against Russia, it is at the level of COREPA that they get rolled over, or have up to now been rolled over every 6 months. And, well, COREPA works in its own interesting ways, which I'm not going to discuss in this program. But I do know one particular incident, scandal if you prefer, which took place back in 2015. At that time, there'd been new elections in Greece, and a new government led by the Syriza party, a left-wing government, had come to power. And they learned, I know all about this story, they learned that Greece's representative at COREPA was supposed to have approved various additional sanctions against Russia, which were approved by COREPA. And the officials, the Greek officials, expressed incredulity because they'd given no such instructions to the Greek representative. And, well, the story went that they said that the Greek representative had not, in fact, voted for these additional sanctions. And that the fact that Greece was registered as having voted for those sanctions was simply not the case. Anyway, that provoked a fierce reaction from the European institutions and from European governments and various media outlets across the Union. Then started to publish stories about how the individual members of the new left-wing Greek government were under investigation by various EU intelligence agencies of EU member states to determine whether or not they had ties to Russia. Anyway, after that particular incident, to the best of my knowledge, Greece has never made any objections about any decisions made by COREPA at all. As of now, I don't know which EU states, which representatives of EU states voted for this rule change in relation to the frozen assets at COREPA and which didn't. I don't know the size of the majority. Probably this is not secret information. If you want to rummage around and find it, perhaps you can, but then again, you might find that it is not quite as straightforward as you might think, and that you have to have some knowledge of the various websites, the various EU websites, to be able to track the information down. I am not going to devote time to doing so. Anyway, there it is. COREPA made this decision, and of course, we'd been told in advance that the decision was coming. The Financial Times had already published articles about this. And, well, this we've had something of the text of the relevant decision. We're told, and this has come from mostly from the President of the European Council, Mr. Costa. Anyway, we're told, and this is quotes now from the document that has come out of COREPA, that concretely the regulation agreed today, that is to say the new rule change, prohibits on a temporary basis, notice the use of the word temporary, any direct or indirect transfer of of assets or reserves of the Central Bank of Russia or of any legal person, entity or body acting on behalf of or at the direction of the Central Bank of Russia, such as the Russian National Welfare Fund, Russian National Wealth Fund. The measures are temporary and should be maintained as long as the making available of significant financial and other resources to Russia to continue its actions in the context of its special military operation against Ukraine pose or threaten to pose serious economic difficulties within the Union and the Member States, and the risk of causing further serious deterioration of the economic situation in the Union and the Member States persists. And then we are told that because the text of the document does not specify any procedure for unfreezing the assets, that means that under existing EU rules, this means that in order to unfreeze the assets, EU countries must now reach a unanimous decision. And as I said, this has been confirmed by the EU President, Antonio Costa, by EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and by EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas. All of these worthy people are telling us that the freeze on the Russian assets is indefinite. Now, notice the language, the completely, how shall I say it, distorted, twisted language. The measures are temporary, but they are not temporary. How can something that is indefinite be temporary? But we're told that the measures are temporary. That's what the statement says. The word temporary now means permanent. That they should be maintained as long as the special military operation continues and poses or threatens to pose serious economic difficulties within the Union and the Member States, and the risk of causing further serious deterioration of the economic situation in the Union and in the Member States persists. What kind of logic is this? The special military operation is being conducted on the territory, the pre-2014 territory of Ukraine. How can it have any direct bearing on the situation within the European Union or in connection with the economies, the economic situation in the EU member states? Of course, the European Union has issued 19 sanctions packages against Russia, 19, and is now working on its 20th sanctions package. And as we all know, it is now proposing next week to take the further enormous step of launching a 140 billion euro loan using these frozen assets, these assets which have been frozen permanently, as collateral. Well, is it these sanctions packages and this decision to launch this loan that is what poses the risk of serious economic difficulties within the Union and the Member States, and which might lead to a further serious deterioration of the economic situation in the Union and in the Member States? Well, I cannot see myself what else it can be. In which case, of course, the logic of this decision is entirely circular. We are making the freezing of the assets permanent because if we didn't, that would create an economic crisis within the Union, which we are causing by our efforts to sanction Russia and to launch a loan against the security of these assets. Now, that to me, as I said, sounds like you're dealing with a crisis, an economic crisis, a potential economic crisis, which you, by your own actions, are causing. This kind of extraordinary circular logic is one which, in any rationally constituted court, would be shot to pieces immediately. And of course, we know, because the Financial Times has told us, that various officials of EU member states, we don't know which member states and which officials, but some of them told the Financial Times that they thought that this was completely contrary to EU law. By the way, they're right. And they also said that doing this was crazy. And if you look at the wording of this, if you follow the wording of this, the fact that something that is permanent is now being called temporary, and something that is being done to address an economic crisis is being done because doing it is going to cause an economic crisis. The logic, legally speaking, I don't think just legally speaking, I think the logic altogether is crazy as well. I have never seen a document produced by a government, or by any public institution quite as extraordinary, as convoluted, and as irrational as this. I really do wonder, by the way, what the representatives who were enacting this document really made of it. Presumably they were all given instructions by Berlin and Paris, perhaps also by Rome. We'll see that the Italians are starting to have cold feet about this. Anyway, presumably they were told that they must vote along these lines. But if any of them have any sense, any understanding of reality, well, as I said, this is extraordinary and it is bizarre and it makes absolutely no legal sense at all. Now, the Hungarian government, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, has used incredibly strong language, using an extremely crude word, which I am not going to repeat, even though what has been done, in my opinion, frankly merits the strongest and coarsest language to describe it. Anyway, Viktor Orban has condemned this in the strongest terms. He has pointed out to its utter lawlessness and its illegality, its clear illegality. And, well, he also says, and it's a point that I have made on these programs, and which we on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I discussed recently in a big program. He also points out, Viktor Orban also points out, as we have done, that this extraordinary lawlessness takes us now straight into the language of arbitrary, unaccountable, if you wish, even despotic rule. I mean, bear in mind, again, a point that I have made in several places now. Hungary voted, somewhat against its better judgment, back in February 2022, to freeze these Russian assets on the basis what it understood to be the cast iron legal basis that it had a veto on their indefinite extension. Now, the assets remain frozen, but that veto has been taken away. Hungary might not have voted to freeze the assets on the basis that has just been done. And I would add that, as I've pointed out again, in many places, that changing the law, whilst the law is in operation in this kind of way, is again fundamentally contrary to all legal principles that I can remember. If you want to change the law, if the EU wants to change the law to say that it gives itself the power to do various things which it has not done previously, well, all other things being equal, it can. But it cannot do that for the present. It can only do that for the future. So what has been done under existing law continues to be done under existing law, and it is only what happens when the law has been changed, from the date when the law has been changed, which then in the future is administered by the new law which has taken effect. This, as I said, is not like that. Now, Orban's very, very strong words strongly suggest that he intends to challenge this decision in the European Court of Justice. And I suspect that others might join him too, Slovakia possibly, perhaps other countries as well. That might be, however, a very, very protracted legal process. Indeed, the European Court of Justice has bent over backwards to go along with pretty much every decision the European Commission and the European authorities make. The judges in the European Court of Justice, who are obviously committed EU supporters, might find it personally very difficult to rule that this decision, this act that has just been made, is unlawful. But if they decide to uphold it, then all I can say is that the language of the judgment, the reasoning of the judgment, is going to become even more tortuous and even more bizarre than it already is. And that is saying something. Anyway, it's important to say that this decision to freeze the assets in this way, to make the freeze, as they like to say, indefinite, which for all practical purposes means permanent, the logic is that the assets will be unfrozen unanimously if the Russians capitulate, agree to pay reparations, and every member state agrees. None of these eventualities, of course, are ever going to take place, and everybody knows it. Even if, by the way, the Russians were to capitulate and were to agree to pay reparations, given the personalities in play in some of the European countries, I think it is far from a foregone conclusion that there would be ever, at any point in the future, a unanimous decision to unfreeze these assets. It could quite easily be the case, for example, that Estonia or Lithuania might say no. Just saying. Anyway, put all that aside. This decision that's been made, legally astonishing as it already is, and full of potential consequences, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Anyway, it is not yet the decision to launch the loan, the 140 billion euro loan, using the Russian assets as collateral. That remains to be decided, and the decision supposedly is going to be made, presumably at a European Council meeting next week. Now, there is still confusion and a degree of uncertainty about this. Belgium continues to hold out against this. proposal. So far, it has received no guarantees from EU states that they will make up any losses that Belgium might incur as a result of Russian legal action, which I will turn to again shortly. So Belgium is still holding out against this. They continue to say that this entire idea is fundamentally wrong and completely illegal. And by the way, they're right. And they're still holding out against it. There are all sorts of stories, you can find them in places like Politico, that the pressure on Belgium is growing all the time, that the Belgian government is going to be put out into the cold. We're even being told that officials in the European Commission are being told to refuse to respond to emails from Belgian officials or to take calls from Belgian officials if the Belgians continue to dig in their heels in this way. And of course, more radical action is certain to be taken before long. And I understand that the media is also now saying that steps are underway, exactly as I predicted, to find some way to get Bart de Wever, the current Prime Minister of Belgium, levered out of office so that a more compliant person can be put in his place. But anyway, for the moment at least, Belgium is standing firm, and Hungary and Slovakia are also standing firm. Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, has by his own account had a contentious call with President Costa, the President of the European Council, and has told him clearly that Slovakia is opposed to this step. More interestingly, one of the big EU countries, a founding member of the original European Economic Community, which, bear in mind, its founding document was the Treaty of Rome, just to say. Anyway, Italy is apparently now also increasingly swinging behind Belgium. The Italian government, as I discussed in a recent program, is becoming increasingly divided about Ukraine. Prime Minister Meloni still seems to be very sympathetic to President Zelensky, but at the same time, she's keen to maintain good relations with President Trump in the United States, and President Trump opposes this step that the Europeans are doing because he wants to use the frozen Russian assets for his own purposes in order to facilitate the peace deal that he's trying to agree with the Russians. So Meloni is having doubts about this, and she no doubt is aware that there are stronger doubts within the Italian government as well. Matteo Salvini has published on X a message saying that the war in Ukraine is lost, and I get the sense that this is an increasingly widely held sentiment in Italy and in the government of Italy as well. So Italy, for the moment at least, is siding with Belgium. Hungary and Slovakia also, but of course they are up against the locomotive, the juggernaut that Merz and Ursula and Callas and Costa and all of these people have put together, that remains determined to do this thing and ignores all counsel against it, counsel coming from the bulk of the legal community, from the European Central Bank, from the International Monetary Fund, from the Belgian government, from Euroclear, where the Russian Central Bank assets are held, from the United States, from Japan. Anyway, they are determined to press ahead and do this thing despite all resistance, all opposition. When they encounter this opposition, it simply makes them more determined. The extraordinary steps that they're taking, this extraordinary decision by Coreper with its bizarre and twisted language, the pressure on Belgium, the decision to stop taking Belgium's calls to try to freeze the Belgians out. Bear in mind, Belgium, one of the founding members of the European Union, one of the countries that, the country that houses the bulk of the European institutions. Anyway, that, as I said, all of that. So given that this is so, given the determination of Merz, Ursula, Macron presumably, all of the others, the Scandinavians as well, the Baltic states too, to do this thing, who can be confident that the mere fact that Italy and Belgium and Hungary and Slovakia and perhaps a number of other countries object, who can believe that this will stop? And given that they have already used these emergency powers under Article 122 of the Treaty, of the Lisbon Treaty, to make this extraordinary decision, who could say with any confidence that they're not going to do that again? That they're not going to say that in order to avoid an economic crisis in the European Union, in order to avoid an economic crisis in the member states, the European Union must provide this loan to Ukraine. Again, the logic might not make much sense to most of us, but that's the kind of argument that they have just made. So what prevents them from doing it all over again and driving through this loan by majority vote, which, as we've seen on Coreper, from this decision on Coreper, by Coreper, they appear to have. And, well, as to providing Belgium with guarantees, Ursula has already drawn up a document setting out assigning liabilities to various countries, Hungary included, by the way. And, well, they could presumably ram that through by majority vote, invoking these emergency powers as well. I have discussed this all extensively now in various programs. So the fact that Maloney, for the moment, is standing out against this, the fact that Bart de Wever seems to be, well, to genuinely believe, sincerely believe that this is wrong, the fact that Hungary and Slovakia are furious about it, and that Hungary is already going to bring legal action, that doesn't mean that the decision next week isn't going to be made. And the British government continues to cheer this along. I discussed 2 days ago in another programme how the City of London, the British banks, are opposing British Starmer government plans to seize £8 billion of Russian state assets here in Britain to back this loan as well. Anyway, nonetheless, the Starmer government also is determined to press ahead, and it is cheering on the Europeans, the European leadership, as they press forward with this loan. Now, there has been much discussion and debate about why the Europeans are doing this. And I've discussed myself the utter obsessiveness that there is behind this move. Partly, it is loathing of Russia, a determination that whatever happens in Ukraine, and I think all of the European leaders at some level probably understand that a reparation loan from Russia is never going to come, and at some point Russia will be victorious. Anyway, they are determined that the Russians must never get their money back. They are determined to punish Russia, as they see it, in that way. So there is that. There is also undoubtedly dislike of Donald Trump and a determination to wreck his current peace initiative. Donald Trump wants the money to be available so as to lubricate, if you like, his peace proposals that he's presenting to the Russians. And of course, being Donald Trump, he also wants some of that money to come back to the United States, undoubtedly to some of his friends in the United States, who he no doubt expects to play a big role in the reconstruction efforts, the reconstruction work in Ukraine that these funds are supposed partially to finance. Anyway, so part of this is undoubtedly in order to spite Donald Trump. In a program we have done on the Duran, which we discussed extensively, we discussed this whole topic extensively. Alex Christoforou and I also discussed how part of the agenda also is to enormously expand the power of the European Union and the European Commission, that the proposals, for example, to impose liabilities on member states to cover any losses have all of the appearance of a forced loan by the member states to the European Union, and ultimately to support Belgium. And that where forced loans and forced levies like this take place, taxation invariably follows. And it would be very surprising to me if there were not at least some people in the European Commission, maybe not amongst the commissioners themselves, but within the bureaucracy, who are thinking along these terms. But I have to say that, to me, this has, again, the recklessness, a recklessness about it which smacks of desperation. They sense that Ukraine is going down. They sense that the Americans are completely disillusioned, or at least the Trump administration is completely disillusioned with the entire Ukraine project. They are shocked at the extent to which the Americans are now openly criticizing the European Union, and as was set out in the National Security Strategy document that was published a few days ago. They worry deeply about the future of their relations with the United States, and they worry very much about the possibility that the Russians and the Americans might come to some long-term understanding with each other, which will leave the Europeans out in the cold. And, well, to me, all of this whole ploy smacks of the desperation of a gambler who has been steadily gambling ever since 2014, but increasingly so since 2022. They've lost their money. They've then gone ahead and they've gambled the house, and they've lost that. Everything has been lost up to now. So they do what gamblers, compulsive gamblers, do in this sort of situation. They're starting to gamble with other people's money. And in order to do that, of course, they have to steal it. And you could see the pattern, because the European Union, way back in 2014, in June 2014, when it went ahead with imposing sectoral sanctions against Russia at that time? Well, it gradually tightened up the sanctions. It then went for much stronger sanctions in February 2022, of which, by the way, the most significant were the freezing of the Russian central bank's reserves. The European Union has imposed more and more sanctions since then. It's provided enormous amounts of financial aid, hundreds of billions of euros of financial aid to the European Union, both directly and via financing provided by the member states, and, by the way, financing provided by the various NGOs, which are also partially funded by the European Union. And it's gambled that every one of these steps, each step one by one, all of the various sanctions, the 19 sanctions packages, that they would bring the Russians to heel, that they would cause the Russian economy to collapse, that they would cause the Russian army to be defeated. There was expectations in February 2022 that the Russian economy would collapse. The French finance minister at the time, Bruno Le Maire, was unwise enough to go on radio in France and admit that that was the intention. There was the expectation that the Ukrainians would triumph militarily with their 2023 offensive, which of course failed disastrously. There was the expectations that the various sanctions against the Russian energy complex, the oil and the gas sanctions, would cause a crisis and a destabilization in Russia. There was the various acts of harassment against the Russian shadow fleet. There were the decisions to stop importing natural gas and oil from Russia, the suspension of Nord Stream 2 in February 2022, the looking away as the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, the tolerance of Poland's decision to close the Yamal pipeline, the decisions to place massive bets on US imports of LNG from the United States, the further decisions that have recently been made to stop importing oil and gas from Russia, either from 2026 or from 2027, the increasing pressure that they've tried to put on China, and by the way, India as well, to try to get them to put economic pressure on the Russians. The Chinese and the Indians have not only resisted that pressure, but the result has been a deterioration in the European Union's relations with these two increasingly powerful countries. Anyway, all of this, and well, Ukraine, in spite of that, is still losing. The European economy is still deteriorating. The Russians are still strong. They're getting stronger. And on the battlefields in Ukraine, they continue to win. And in a few weeks, in a few months' time, by the end of February, some say March, let's be conservative and say April or May, or perhaps halfway through next year, Ukraine is supposed to be about to run out of money for its budget. So all of the gambles have failed. And now you take the biggest gamble of all. You're gambling with the other side's money. It's like a gambler who puts all the money on the same number and the same color, by the way, in a roulette on the roulette table, and the money goes, the other assets go, the property goes, the house goes, and now, as I said, they've taken the further step of gambling with the money of someone else. So this is what it looks like to me It's obsessive, but it is also compulsive. For the record, in my opinion, the best overall discussion of this extraordinary step that has been made has up to now been made by Alistair Crook. Well, you can also perhaps add to that things that have been said on this program and which we've said on the Duran. But this is, if you want to understand the psychology, well, that, it seems to me, is the best explanation of the psychology that I can come up with. I have met gamblers like that in the past. I'm sorry to say, I knew one such gambler who was a member of my own family. And I knew something about this compulsion. And this does have the quality of a gambling compulsion about this. The gambler always says, let's pile on the money, the wheel will spin, the ball will fall into the right place once, at which point I can recoup all my losses and cover all my debts. The Europeans are saying to themselves, let's do this thing, let's give the Ukrainians just enough money to keep going for a few more months, a year, perhaps two. We believe, we're being told by our intelligence agencies, that the Russians are losing 1,000 men a day. Obviously, they're going to run out of steam eventually. So let's just do this thing. And this time, who knows, maybe we'll be lucky this time. And if we're lucky, we'll be lucky, we will win big, and we will be able to cover all the costs and all the losses, and we will be the ones who will come out the winners. The winners over the hated Russians, and by the way, also the winners against the hated Donald Trump and the equally hated ally that he has in Europe, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. Well, gambles like that, in my experience, never ever succeed. Again, as I said, I've seen many examples. I have seen examples, and perhaps not so many, but quite a few, of gambling addictions. In my experience, what happens to people who have that kind of gambling addiction is that they go catastrophically bankrupt and often criminally bankrupt as well. Just saying. And, well, I can't see why this time it's going to be any different. Well, the Russians are not taking this lying down. And yesterday, reports appeared, confirmed by the Russian central bank, that the Russians had begun legal action. And the first step they took was to initiate proceedings. The Russian central bank initiated proceedings against Euroclear for its losses arising from Euroclear's failure to protect the money, the Russian money, held on deposit with Euroclear. The Russians started the proceedings in the main commercial court in Russia, the Moscow Arbitration Court. And of course the point is, and this is what needs to be understood here, this is only the first step in the case, the legal case, that the Russians are going to conduct, because the Russians are going to win, obviously, the case in the Moscow Arbitration Court. They would do so partly because, obviously, it is the Moscow Arbitration Court. It is inconceivable that the judges of that court are going to decide against the Russian central bank in a case like this. But the point is that the legal case the Russians are going to bring, not just to the Moscow Arbitration Court, but to the various other courts that they're going to enforce this judgment through, are going to be exceptionally, the cases are exceptionally strong. I've discussed how most of the legal community, I'm not saying everybody, you will always find the lawyer who will take the contrarian view. That's the nature of the legal world. But most of the legal community around the world regard this action as illegal. The International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, Euroclear itself, the Belgian government, they've all made admissions, public admissions, which also make fairly obvious the illegality of these acts. So, once the Russians have that judgment from the Moscow Arbitration Court, they can then take it to international arbitration. And here I would refer to an exceptionally fine article by Eve Smith on naked capitalism. Eve Smith is somebody who has written extensively about the investor-state settlements dispute procedures that have been developing around the world since the 1980s, the way in which these arrangements that are now embedded in commercial treaties set up tribunals whose decisions are made often in conditions of considerable secrecy by a relatively small pool of international arbitrators, and which are binding in the jurisdictions, in national jurisdictions of the states that are parties to these treaties. She has pointed out how this procedure has been used in the past by international investors to gut employment protections and environmental protections and all such things. Just saying. And now, as she absolutely correctly says in her latest article about this particular operation that we're now going to see, she says that it's likely that what we're going to see is this whole procedure, this entire mechanism that was created by the neoliberals, effectively turned against them. Pass the popcorn. This is a direct quote from her article. Things are about to get ugly. The long-standing erosion of national rights in favour of stateless investors is being turned against its neoliberal creators. One of the structures that has been created to promote globalization, the investor-state settlement dispute procedure, is now being turned by one of the national states that's always had a degree of skepticism about globalization, by Russia, and is going to be used against the globalists who are stronger in Europe than they are anywhere else in the world. Well, the irony of that is extraordinary. What I will say is that, like all legal procedures, I expect that this is going to take a very, very long time to work through. I suspect we were going to get a decision from the Moscow Arbitration Tribunal quite quickly. Moscow Arbitration Court, I should say, not tribunal, quite quickly. But it is likely that the various other legal procedures around the world will take an especially long time. I'm guessing years rather than weeks or months, even in what is, frankly, a very clear-cut case like this. But it will be very interesting to see how it plays out. And Eve Smith says that, yes, the European Union looks like it's prepared to tear up laws further still. This procedure is going to be invoked by Russia, apparently, on the basis of a commercial treaty agreed by the Soviet Union, as it still was, with Belgium and Luxembourg in 1989. That treaty is still in effect. So the European Union is going to just basically tear up that particular treaty. But putting aside the colossal reputational damage that all of this is doing, even if the European Union says that whatever decisions these tribunals, this international tribunal makes, is not going to be enforceable on the territory of the European Union, it could very well be enforceable in other jurisdictions. And one particular jurisdiction, which it seems the Europeans, Euroclear itself, is extremely nervous about, is Singapore, which Euroclear, as a massive international depository, it holds assets worth around $4 trillion, or so I understand. Well, Euroclear apparently has substantial assets in Singapore, which is a major financial and legal center, and the pattern of decisions taken apparently by the courts in Singapore is that they consider sovereign rights of states, the principle of sovereign state immunity over assets, to be absolutely cast iron. And this has been central to Singapore's success in achieving its current position as one of the world's strongest and most secure financial centers. I suspect there will be other places where similar decisions, similar court decisions take place. Probably Hong Kong, I'm guessing, in all sorts of other places as well. Some of the Arab states, there are strong courts, by the way, based in some of the other Arab states too. Anyway, as Eve Smith says, this could all turn out very ugly. But be aware that it might take a very long time. Personally, if we have a whole decade of litigation all around the world with the Russians fighting legal battles against the Europeans in court after court, tribunal after tribunal, jurisdiction after jurisdiction, harassing and pressing the Europeans in every place, well, I would not be surprised. In fact, on the contrary, I would expect it. Now, as to the reputational damage that the Europeans are going to suffer from all of this, well, I've discussed this already. Investors around the world, states around the world now know that if you put your money in Europe, if the European authorities decide to divest it from you, to take it from you, to steal it, if you prefer, there is absolutely no legal constraint that is there which will stop them doing it. And again, this might not have a dramatic effect immediately, but over time, especially if these court cases continue for a full decade around the world, I can perfectly easily see myself how investor confidence in Europe could drain away. Is it worth it? Is it worth it for the Europeans to do this thing? Obviously not. But when you deal with people who are obsessive and compulsive, as the leaders of the European Union apparently are, well, as I've said in the past, geostrategic analysis, geopolitical analysis of the kind that I do on a program like this basically stops. You're into the world of psychiatry, and I'm not going to venture deeper there than I have already done. Well, there we are. That's where we are over this today. We'll see how all of this plays out. There is, I think, still a small chance that the Belgians and the Hungarians and the Italians might dig in next week, and it may be that this loan still won't crystallise. But I fully expect that further decisions to launch this loan will be made. Whatever happens next week might slow this process down, but I doubt by now that it can stop it. And this decision that Coreper has already taken, in effect, because of its illegality, is going to increase the momentum to take the next step. Because, by the way, that is something else that tends to happen. When you take the first illegal step, you generally have to take the further one, and the further one, and the still further one, in order to justify or at least rationalize the first one. So, given what they have already done by announcing that the freeze is no longer temporary but indefinite, given that that is so, it seems to me that they can't stop now. Anyway, that's where we are. Now, the diplomacy continues. Witkoff is apparently coming to Europe. There's going to be a discussion today with the Europeans and the Ukrainians about the current state of President Trump's plans. I'm frankly rapidly losing interest in this whole story. It ought to be obvious by now that this plan is going absolutely nowhere. Donald Trump is becoming increasingly critical of President Zelensky, as I have already discussed. But it seems to me that the reality is that this whole process of this peace plan is running into the ground. And here, by the way, I'm going to take issue with a common narrative that is now spread all over Europe. You read it in the European media. You even read it in places like Foreign Affairs and, some journals in the United States, that this complex negotiation between the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians has supposedly exposed the extent to which the Europeans and the Ukrainians are vassals. I would say that the opposite, to my mind, appears to be true. Far from Trump being the emperor of the West, some people assume, the man who can dictate outcomes, on the contrary, it looks to me that the Europeans and the Ukrainians, exactly as Daniel Davis pointed out to me recently, that the Ukrainians and the Europeans are showing that they are repeatedly able to call his bluff. Trump promised Putin, apparently, well, according to the Russians, in Anchorage, that he would be able to force Zelensky to agree to the principles of the deal he wants to do with the Russians. He was going to succeed in getting Zelensky to accept that there can be no NATO membership of Ukraine, that the Ukrainians must withdraw from Donbass, that they must accept caps of their armed forces. And he's been unable to deliver because the Europeans and the Ukrainians have repeatedly, since Anchorage, managed to call Trump's bluff. And I find it somewhat incredible that they are able to do this. But to my mind, what it shows is that Trump's position in the United States, at least, is nowhere near as strong as many of the commentators appear to imagine. Anyway, I am not going to waste more time discussing this diplomatic initiative in this program. I'm going to now turn briefly at the end of this program to a discussion of the military situation. Now, the first thing to say is I'm going to return to this tedious subject, at least I find it tedious, of Kupiansk. Zelensky turned up outside Kupiansk, near a big board which has Kupiansk in letters. So he was not inside Kupiansk itself, and he said that he produced a video of himself there, and he said that he'd been inside Kupiansk and that he'd met the soldiers there and that they were liberating the town. And there's been reports from all sorts of Ukrainian sources, including DS, which is now, as far as I can see, firmly under the thumb of the Ukrainian General Staff, that the Ukrainians have the Russians surrounded in Kupiansk. And of course, a lot of people have rushed and have accepted that this story must be true on the basis of the video footage of himself that Zelensky has provided. Now, let me say straight away that I've seen the footage and I do believe it is contemporary. I believe that it was made at some point over the last 24, 48 hours. So I believe it is relatively new. And I believe that Zelensky was where he said he was. But he has undermined, as far as I am concerned, his claims by his further claim that he actually entered Kupiansk himself and congratulated the soldiers there. Had that actually been the case, I would have expected him to provide footage of it. Instead, he provides footage of himself outside Kupiansk. Now, it is very important for Zelensky to change the narrative very fast at this point in time. The Ukrainian army has just lost Siversk, and there is no serious dispute about this. And given that Siversk was located deep inside a salient and was surrounded on all sides by Russian territory, there is no possibility of reversing that battle, or at least, or even of convincingly pretending to do so. And the Russians, even as Zelensky was having pictures made of himself outside Kupiansk, taking selfies of himself and having pictures made of himself outside Kupiansk, even as Zelensky was doing that, the Russians were taking Russian journalists through the ruins of Pokrovsk. Now, there continue to be many claims in the Western media that the Ukrainians still have a presence in Pokrovsk, that the Ukrainians still control positions in the north of Pokrovsk. I read a rather interesting article yesterday on this whole topic in the London Times, and it was actually rather interesting because one of the Ukrainian commanders was asked about General Syrskyi's claim that the Ukrainians control 13 square kilometers of Pokrovsk, and this commander scoffed. He said this was absolute nonsense. In his own imagination was what this Ukrainian commander said in this London Times to the London Times. But then this commander also said that yes, he does manage to get his own troops into Pokrovsk, and he's repeated the claim that some people on the Ukrainian side of the internet have made that this column, this armored column of this Russian armored column, that of which video footage appeared a few days ago, that this column was supposedly destroyed by the Ukrainians as it was entering Pokrovsk. I've not seen footage of this armored column being destroyed. And for the record, my understanding is that the geolocations show this armored column in the north of Pokrovsk. But anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but the Ukrainians, in short, have been trying to give the impression that they still have at least a foothold in Pokrovsk. The Russian Defense Ministry escorted journalists, Russian journalists, Western journalists simply refused to go, something which I think, by the way, is profoundly wrong and deeply mistaken. Anyway, they escorted Russian journalists around Pokrovsk, and they said, look, this is the situation. You can see that we control the town, and there is video footage, by the way, of the journalists in Pokrovsk. And frankly, to me, the video footage suggests a rather quiet situation in Pokrovsk, a rather stable situation, and one which the Russians fully control. Of course, Pokrovsk is a big place. It may be that in some places there is still some fighting going on, but if so, it looks to me as if it is likely on the margins. Now, notice that there's been little coverage, scant coverage in the West about the fall of Siversk, and, well, no coverage at all that I'm aware of this visit by these Russian journalists in Pokrovsk. Now, Zelensky obviously knows about the fall of Siversk, and he probably was aware that the Russians were putting together a team of journalists to visit Pokrovsk. So I suspect that he felt that he had to change the narrative fast, which probably explains the quick dash to positions outside Kupiansk. I remain of the view that the Russians control Kupiansk. The Russians continue to say that Ukrainian troops do enter Kupiansk. They have conducted, well, raids maybe, counterattacks there, if you want to use that word. The Russians say that these counterattacks are very costly to the Ukrainians in lives, and that overall the Russians have stable control of the town. And I think this is almost certainly the case, because were it otherwise, well, it would be contrary to the flow of evidence that we have seen repeatedly in other battles. The Ukrainians have made similar claims about Toretsk, about Kotlino, about all sorts of other places over the course of the last year, where they have pretended that fighting is continuing to go on, where they have claimed to still have footholds, long after these places have passed under Russian control entirely. Another place, Dobropilye, north of Gulyapolye, is another such example. Anyway, let's move beyond Pokrovsk. The Russians, Kupiansk, and Zelensky's visits to these places. Elsewhere, the Russians continue, and there is no serious dispute about this, they continue to advance. And we've had apparently significant video footage from Gulyapolye itself, the Gulyapolye, the city in Zaporozhye region. And it seems now that not only is there no doubt that the Russians have crossed the Ganchur River, but it looks as if they've established several bridgeheads on the west bank of the Ganchur River in Gulyapolye itself, and there is now heavy fighting going on in the central part of Guliapolye. Heavy fighting taking place there. Guliapolye is not a big place. I'm not going to try and guesstimate how much of the town the Russians exactly control, but it looks to me as if Ukrainian defenses in Guliapolye are crumbling. And I'm going to guess that in about a week, the town will fall. The Russians will be in control of Guliapolye. And that will obviously change the whole situation decisively in Zaporozhye region as well. And, well, there's also reports now that having captured Siversk, the Russians are moving westwards towards Slavyansk. They're preparing for an attack on Slavyansk itself, and there have been some claims that there is an important power station which provides electric power to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and this is apparently located to the east of these two cities, right in the path of the Russian advance. The Russian advance from this point on looks unstoppable. Presumably, this power station will fall, at which point it will be the Russians who will have their hand on the switch. They will be able to turn off the electric power, the Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, when they choose to. In the meantime, something else is taking place on the front lines and on the battles. Well, not on the front lines, but in the war. Two very important things have been happening too. Firstly, the Russians last night launched another big drone and missile strike across Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry says that this was a massive one in response to what they like to say are terrorist acts launched by Ukraine against civilian facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation. The Russian armed forces delivered a massive strike, with ground and sea-based high-precision weapons, Kinzhal, air ballistic hypersonic missiles, and long-range unmanned aerial vehicles against the Ukrainian defense industry, enterprises and energy facilities providing their work. So Ukrainian attacks on the Russian energy system, which, as I've discussed many times and has now been confirmed, have had pinprick effects, are now continuing to provoke these far more powerful, far more devastating Russian strikes on Ukrainian energy facilities in response. And I see drone footage of Odessa, for example, which is now, was at the time when that footage was taken, in complete blackout. And, blackouts are now becoming more and more common across Ukraine, even as winter deepens and Ukraine's own top energy officials have recently taken to saying that the energy system in Ukraine is now close to collapse. So that was one big thing that the Russians did. But just as the Ukrainian attacks on tankers trading in and carrying Russian oil have continued, and the Ukrainians have continued with those attacks, disregarding warnings from Putin himself. Well, we see the same pattern emerge, because yesterday, the Russians took exactly the countermeasures that they have warned. They started, or that Putin warned about. They launched strikes on commercial shipping in Odessa, in the port of Odessa. They claimed that the ship, which had a Turkish flag, that was docked in Odessa, which they attacked, had been carrying military equipment to Ukraine. Of course, I have no way of knowing whether or not that is true. But it seems to me that the Russians, by launching this attack on a commercial ship in the port of Odessa, in that way, are responding to the attacks on the tankers and are moving towards establishing a blockade of Ukrainian ports. And as I have said, they have always had the means to do this. There has never been a moment in the war when that option did not exist. Now they've been given the pretext to do it, and they're in the course of doing it. So there it is. That's it seems to me, where we are at the moment. Ukraine conducts pinprick attacks against Russian refineries. It gets its energy system devastated, and Ukrainians are left without power and heating and electric light in winter. Ukraine conducts attacks against tankers, some of which might be trading in Russian oil, and the Russians respond by massive strikes against Ukrainian ports, in effect imposing a blockade of these ports. I cannot understand myself the logic or the rationale behind these things. But anyway, there we are. My sense continues to be that the war will continue until a military victory is achieved, and that will be by the Russians. But this action that the European Union took yesterday is going to have implications that extend far beyond the war itself. There is, as businessmen well know, something that is referred to as the sunk costs fallacy, that the more money you pour into a project, even as it fails, the more driven you are to invest in that same failing project in order to justify your failed investment. The Europeans are trapped in their own sunk costs fallacy, and it will choke them. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish this program today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our new Substack site. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.